The jungle was unforgiving, its shadows alive with danger. Amidst the towering trees, a pair of golden eyes gleamed, wounded, starving, yet defiant. When a millionaire's daughter stumbled upon the dying German shepherd, she had no idea it would change everything. The rain had started again, a relentless downpour that turned the jungle floor into a mess of thick mud and rotting leaves. Isabella Kensington adjusted the hood of her raincoat, her boots sinking with each step as she navigated through the dense foliage. The air was thick, humid, carrying the scent of wet earth and something else, something metallic and sharp, like rusted iron. A distant howl echoed through the trees, sending a chill up her spine. She wasn't supposed to be here. She had come to the jungle to escape, though escape from what? She wasn't entirely sure. The expectations, the suffocating wealth, the polished marble floors of the Kensington estate that never felt like home. Her father, Victor Kensington, was a man of towering ambition, a self-made billionaire who saw life as a series of transactions. Isabella had always been the exception. She wasn't like her siblings, who relished the glamour and the power. She wanted something more, something real. The expedition had been her way out, an excuse to leave behind the sterile world of boardrooms and business deals. Studying rare plant species in South America was a perfect justification, one her father reluctantly accepted. But now, standing in the middle of the jungle, soaked to the bone and with the feeling that something or someone was watching her, she wondered if she had made a mistake. Then she heard it, a whimper. Faint at first, nearly swallowed by the rustling leaves and the steady drone of insects. She froze, her heart pounding. It came again, a low, desperate cry, barely audible over the rain. Isabella turned, sweeping her flashlight over the dense greenery. The beam of light trembled in her hands as it landed on a patch of fur golden, matted with dirt and blood. A dog. Isabella took a step closer, the thick underbrush clawing at her legs. The shepherd lay motionless, his sides rising and falling in shallow breaths. His ribs jutted out, his fur was tangled with brambles, and there was a deep gash across his hind leg. He was dying. Something clenched inside her chest. She had always felt drawn to the broken, the forgotten. Maybe because, despite her privileged life, she had often felt the same. Kneeling beside the dog, she reached out a trembling hand. His ears twitched, but he didn't move. His amber eyes locked onto hers, filled with fear, exhaustion, and something else. Trust. She swallowed hard, a lump forming in her throat. "I won't leave you," she whispered. She had no idea that saving him would unravel a truth far more terrifying than the jungle itself. The dog's breathing was shallow, uneven. Every rise and fall of his chest seemed like a battle against the weight of his wounds. Isabella pressed a hand against his side, feeling the tremors rippling through his body. He was barely holding on. Her mind raced. She had no medical training beyond basic first aid, and she wasn't sure how long he had been lying there. Judging by the state of his injuries, at least a couple of days. His body was burning with fever, a clear sign of infection. If she left him, he wouldn't survive the night. A pang of hesitation gripped her. The camp was miles away, carrying him through the thick underbrush. In the dark, in the rain, it was impossible. But leaving him here, that wasn't an option either. She took a deep breath, bracing herself. "All right, buddy. I don't know if you can hear me, but we're getting out of here." Sliding her arms under his frail body, she lifted. A sharp yelp cut through the night, and she winced, guilt twisting in her gut. The dog's body was alarmingly light, too thin for a German shepherd his size. He had been starving for weeks, maybe months. Who had left him here, and why? The jungle loomed around her as she trudged forward, the rain soaking through her clothes, her muscles screaming from the effort. The trees whispered with the wind, their tangled limbs casting eerie shadows in the dim glow of her flashlight. Every so often, she thought she heard something rustling in the distance, a presence lurking just beyond sight. She shook the thought away, focusing on the dog's shallow breaths against her chest. One step at a time, she had to keep moving. By the time she reached the camp, she was drenched, shaking from exhaustion. The expedition team had already retreated into their tents for the night, the fire reduced to glowing embers. Isabella stumbled toward her tent, carefully laying the dog on the dry ground beneath the small awning. She grabbed the first aid kit, her hands unsteady as she rummaged through the supplies. Antiseptic, gauze, sutures. She had never stitched up a wound before, but there was no time for doubt. "This is going to hurt," she murmured, more to herself than to him. As she cleaned the gash, the dog tensed, his body rigid with pain. But he didn't fight her. He just watched her, those golden eyes locked onto her face, as if he knew that she was trying to help. Knew that, for the first time in what was probably a long time, he wasn't alone. By the time she finished, exhaustion pulled at her limbs, but relief flooded her chest. He was still alive. That was all that mattered. She lay down beside him, the rain tapping gently against the tent. In the dim light, she traced the jagged scar that ran across his muzzle, wondering who he had belonged to before he had ended up here. Tomorrow she would have to find out. Tomorrow, everything would change. The jungle awakened with the first light of dawn. Birds shrieked from the treetops, their calls echoing through the thick canopy. Isabella stirred, her body aching from the previous night's ordeal. The German shepherd lay beside her, his breath still weak but steadier than before. She studied him in the golden morning light, her fingers brushing against the thick fur of his neck. He was a fighter. A soft rustling outside her tent made her sit up. She turned to see Dr. Henshaw, the expedition's lead researcher, standing at the entrance, arms crossed. His weathered face was unreadable. "Isabella," he said, his voice laced with quiet concern. "What is that?" She sighed, already anticipating the resistance. "A dog," she answered simply. "I can see that," he muttered, stepping closer. "And why exactly is there a half-dead dog in our camp?" She clenched her jaw. "Because I found him in the jungle, alone, injured. I wasn't going to let him die out there." Dr. Henshaw exhaled, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "This isn't a rescue mission. We're in the middle of an unexplored region with limited supplies. That animal could be sick, dangerous." "He's not dangerous," Isabella cut in, her voice sharper than she intended. "And if I hadn't found him, he would have been dead by now." Henshaw studied her for a long moment before shaking his head. "Do what you want, but if that dog becomes a liability, you're responsible for him." Isabella turned back to the dog, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. The jungle was vast, untamed. How had he ended up here? He was clearly no stray. His build, his coat, even in its ragged state, spoke of a strong pedigree. Someone had abandoned him, but why? She had no idea that finding him was only the beginning. By midday, the German shepherd had managed to sit up on his own. Isabella had given him water, fed him bits of her breakfast, and cleaned his wound again. He was still weak, but there was a fire in his eyes, a will to survive that made her heart twist. The expedition team was preparing for another day of research, packing up their equipment and preparing to venture deeper into the jungle. Isabella debated whether to stay behind, but something in her gut told her that answers lay ahead. She secured the dog near her tent, making sure he had enough water. "I'll be back," she whispered, running a hand gently over his head. He whined softly, but didn't resist as she stepped away. As the team pushed forward, the air grew thicker, the trees more gnarled. Hours passed, the heat pressing against their backs as they made their way through dense underbrush. Then something strange happened. Dr. Henshaw, who had been walking ahead, suddenly stopped. "Hold up," he called, his tone different. Isabella pushed forward, stepping beside him. At first, she didn't see anything unusual, just more jungle, more trees. But then she noticed it the unnatural way the underbrush had been disturbed. A trail. Not one made by animals. Humans had been here. Her heart pounded as she crouched, examining the ground. Broken twigs, deep boot imprints in the mud. "These tracks are fresh," she murmured, "maybe a day or two old." Henshaw exchanged a glance with the others. Who else would be out here? A heavy silence settled over them. The jungle was supposed to be untouched, miles away from civilization. If someone had been here recently, they weren't lost travelers. They were here for a reason. And Isabella had a sinking feeling it had something to do with the dog. They followed the tracks, each step drawing them deeper into the unknown. The jungle thickened, vines coiling around trees like serpents. The air grew still, charged with an unspoken tension. Then they saw it. A clearing, unnaturally symmetrical, as if someone had carved it out of the jungle. In the center stood an abandoned metal structure, rusted and overgrown, camouflaged by time. "What the hell is this?" one of the researchers muttered. Isabella's stomach twisted. She stepped closer, her boots crunching against something brittle. She glanced down and froze. Bones. Small, scattered remains animals, not human. Still, the sight sent a shudder through her. Something had happened here. Dr. Henshaw approached the structure, running a hand over the corroded metal. "This looks like an old research facility," he mused. "Could be decades old." Isabella wasn't convinced. It didn't feel abandoned. It felt recently disturbed. She moved to the entrance, pressing a hesitant hand against the door. It groaned as it gave way, revealing a dimly lit interior. Dust swirled in the air, the scent of decay thick. She swallowed hard and stepped inside. The walls were lined with rusted cages, large ones, too large for ordinary animals. The metal bars were bent in places, as if something had forced its way out. She reached out, fingers grazing the cold steel, and flinched. Claw marks, deep, desperate. A pit formed in her stomach. "Isabella," Henshaw called, his voice urgent. She turned to find him standing by a desk, sifting through old files. He handed her a weathered document, the pages yellowed with age. Project Fenrir. She scanned the text, her pulse pounding. The document was incomplete, torn in places, but the words she could make out made her blood run cold. Canine genetic enhancement, behavioral modification, military application. The German Shepherd. He hadn't just been abandoned. He had escaped. A sudden crash from outside sent her heart leaping into her throat. The team spun around, eyes wide. Isabella bolted out of the structure, her breath catching when she saw what had happened. The dog. He had freed himself from where she had tied him. He stood just beyond the clearing, his fur bristling, his posture rigid. But he wasn't looking at them. He was looking at the trees, at the figures emerging from the jungle. Men dressed in tactical gear, their faces obscured by masks. They moved with precision, their weapons drawn. One of them pointed directly at the German Shepherd. "There's the asset," he said. Isabella's blood turned to ice. They weren't here by accident. They had been looking for the dog. Before she could react, the shepherd let out a guttural snarl, his body coiling like a spring. And then, chaos erupted. Gunfire cracked through the air. The expedition team scattered, diving for cover as the masked men advanced. Isabella barely had time to think, only to move. She lunged for the dog, grabbing his collar just as he tensed to leap. A hand seized her arm, yanking her back. She turned, coming face to face with one of the masked men. His grip tightened, his eyes cold beneath the dark fabric. "You don't understand what you're interfering with," he growled. Isabella struggled, but the dog reacted first. A blur of fur and teeth, a vicious snarl, then a scream as the man was ripped away. The shepherd had lunged, sinking his teeth into the attacker's arm. Blood splattered against the leaves. "Run!" someone shouted. Isabella didn't need to be told twice. She grabbed the dog and bolted, weaving through the trees as gunfire chased her. She had rescued him. Now she had to save him, because whatever Project Fenrir was, it wasn't over. And they were willing to kill to get him back. The jungle was a blur of shadows and chaos as Isabella ran, her breath ragged, her legs screaming with exhaustion. The German Shepherd was right beside her, his paws thudding against the damp earth, his body tense with primal energy. Gunfire still echoed behind them, sharp cracks piercing the dense canopy. They weren't shooting to scare, they were shooting to kill. Branches snapped as the masked men pursued them, their footsteps heavy, methodical. Isabella's mind raced. She had no weapons, no way to fight back. She was deep in unfamiliar terrain with a wounded dog and nowhere to hide. And worst of all, she didn't even know who she was running from. Her foot caught on a thick root, and she tumbled forward, hitting the ground hard. Pain exploded in her palms as she scraped them against the rough bark of an exposed tree. The shepherd stopped immediately, circling back, his golden eyes locked onto her with fierce urgency. "Go," she gasped, pushing herself up. "Run!" But he didn't leave. He growled, a deep, menacing sound that sent a shiver down her spine. She turned her head just in time to see one of the men break through the underbrush, his rifle raised. Time slowed. The shepherd lunged. The man barely had a second to react before a flash of teeth and fury slammed into him. The rifle discharged into the air, the bullet whizzing past Isabella's ear. She scrambled backward, watching in horror as the shepherd clamped his jaws around the man's forearm. The attacker howled in pain, trying to shake the dog off, but the shepherd's grip was unrelenting. Isabella didn't think. She reached for the rifle. The moment her fingers curled around the metal, another figure burst through the trees. She swung. The rifle's butt cracked against the second man's ribs, sending him staggering back. Adrenaline coursed through her veins, overriding the fear that threatened to consume her. She turned to run. A deafening shot rang out. The shepherd yelped, his body jerking violently. Isabella's world shattered in an instant. "No!" she screamed. The dog collapsed, his body hitting the jungle floor with a sickening thud. Blood seeped into the damp earth beneath him, a dark stain against his golden fur. Isabella felt herself moving before she could think, dropping to her knees, her hands shaking as she pressed them against the wound. "Stay with me," she whispered desperately. A hand grabbed her shoulder. She barely had time to react before she was wrenched backward, dragged away from the dog's limp body. "Enough of this," a voice growled in her ear. A third man had her now, his grip bruising as he forced her to stand. Isabella thrashed, kicking, trying to break free, but he was too strong. "You have no idea what you've gotten yourself into," he hissed. Her heart pounded as she struggled. "He's just a dog." The man laughed, a humorless, chilling sound. "Number he's not." Isabella froze, the weight of his words pressing into her like a vice. The shepherd wasn't just an ordinary animal. He was something else. Something they were willing to kill for. The man yanked her forward, forcing her through the tangled jungle. Isabella stumbled, her mind reeling. She kept twisting, trying to catch a glimpse of the dog, but he lay motionless where he had fallen, his blood pooling beneath him. Her chest ached. She had risked everything to save him, and now? Number. She gritted her teeth, rage pushing past the terror in her veins. He wasn't dead. He couldn't be. They pushed her into a small clearing where the other men were already gathering. One of them was nursing a torn sleeve, blood staining the fabric. The shepherd's bite. The man glared at Isabella with venom in his eyes. "She's the one who found him," he spat. The leader, the one who had spoken to her earlier, studied her carefully. His mask was now off, revealing a face lined with years of hardened experience. "You should have walked away," he said. "Who are you?" Isabella demanded, her voice shaking. He ignored her, glancing back toward the jungle. "Where's the asset?" A tense pause. Then one of the men answered, "Down. Shot him in the shoulder. He won't be moving anytime soon." A small, cruel smile twitched at the leader's lips. "Then finish it." Isabella's stomach dropped. "No," she choked out. "You can't." The leader barely glanced at her. It was never meant to survive this long. She felt her blood turn to ice. It, not he. Before she could process the implications, the man gestured, and one of his soldiers turned, rifle in hand, ready to go back for the shepherd. Panic ignited inside her. She couldn't let this happen. Without thinking, she moved. She twisted hard, breaking free of the grip that held her, and before the man could react, she lunged for the soldier's rifle. Her fingers wrapped around the barrel just as he turned. The weapon discharged. For a moment, the world went silent. Then the soldier staggered back, eyes wide, blood blooming across his chest. He hit the ground, unmoving. Isabella gasped, horror surging through her. She had never killed anyone before. A beat of stunned silence passed before chaos erupted. "Get her!" the leader roared. She ran. Blindly, instinctively, she sprinted back toward the jungle, weaving through the trees, her heart hammering against her ribs. The shouts behind her grew distant, but she knew they wouldn't stop. They couldn't afford to let her escape. But she didn't care. She had only one thought in her mind. The dog. She burst into the clearing where he had fallen. He was still there, motionless, too still. "No, no, no," she whispered, dropping to her knees. Her hands hovered over his fur, unsure of what to do, where to touch, how to fix this. Then, a shuddering breath. Her own breath hitched. He was alive. But barely. "We have to move," she whispered, glancing toward the jungle. The men would be here any second. She had no time, no plan. She hooked her arms under the shepherd's body and heaved. He let out a weak whimper but didn't fight her. He was too exhausted, too hurt. Her legs burned as she staggered forward, dragging him into the undergrowth just as the first soldier's voice rang through the trees. "She's here somewhere." The hunt wasn't over. But Isabella wasn't running anymore. She was going to fight. And she wasn't going to let them take him. Not now. Not ever. The jungle had never felt this vast, this infinite. It was as if Isabella had been swallowed whole, lost in a world that had no end, no mercy. Her breath came in ragged bursts, her muscles trembling as she staggered forward. The German shepherd, his weight pressing against her, felt heavier with every step. His fur was damp with blood, his breathing shallow. She wanted to scream, to collapse, to let the exhaustion take her. But she didn't. She couldn't. The men were still out there, searching, hunting. If she stopped now, if she gave in, they would find them, and it would all be over. Her legs buckled, and she crashed to her knees, barely able to keep the dog from hitting the ground too hard. The damp earth clung to her skin, the scent of rain-soaked leaves thick in the air. She placed a hand against his ribs, feeling the weak rise and fall of his breath. His life was slipping through her fingers, and there was nothing she could do. "No, no, no," she whispered, pressing her hand harder against his wound. Blood seeped between her fingers, warm and slick. She could feel his body twitch beneath her touch. She was losing him. A sob fought its way up her throat, but she clenched her teeth, forcing it back down. She wouldn't cry. Not now. Not when he needed her to be strong. She looked around frantically, searching for anything that could help, but the jungle was an endless stretch of darkness, thick and unyielding. There was no way out. Then, through the tangled mess of leaves and shadows, she saw it. A structure. Barely visible in the moonlight, it stood against the jungle like a ghost of the past. A forgotten outpost, swallowed by time. It was old, rusted, its walls covered in creeping vines. But it was shelter. Hope flared in her chest, weak but burning. She forced herself to her feet, gripping the shepherd's limp body as tightly as she could. Every muscle in her body screamed in protest, but she didn't stop. She pushed forward, stumbling through the underbrush, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The outpost was closer now. She could see the metal door hanging slightly ajar, rusted at the hinges. She didn't care what was inside, as long as it wasn't them. With the last of her strength, she dragged the dog inside. The air was stale, thick with dust and the scent of damp earth. Moonlight filtered through the broken windows, casting eerie shadows across the walls. She collapsed onto the cold concrete floor, her body too drained to move. The shepherd let out a weak whimper, his golden eyes barely open. "You're okay," she whispered, reaching out to stroke his fur. "You're safe now." She didn't know if she was telling him the truth. Her fingers traced the jagged scar along his muzzle, a deep, ugly mark that stood out against his golden fur. Who had done this to him? What had he been through before she found him? Her mind drifted back to the facility, to the rusted cages and the torn documents labeled Project Fenrir. The words haunted her. Canine genetic enhancement, behavioral modification, military application. He wasn't just a dog. He was something else. A creation, a weapon. And someone wanted him dead. Her stomach twisted at the thought. He had been abandoned in the jungle, left to die. But why? Had he escaped? Had they let him go? Or had he refused to be what they wanted him to be? The idea made her chest tighten. He wasn't just running for his life. He was running from them. And now, so was she. She swallowed hard, glancing toward the door. The jungle outside was eerily quiet, but she knew better than to trust it. They were still out there, searching. They wouldn't give up until they had what they came for. But they wouldn't take him. She wouldn't let them. The dog let out a soft sound, barely more than a breath. But she felt it, his warmth against her skin, his presence beside her. He was still alive. And as long as he was alive, she would fight. She pulled off her jacket, pressing it gently against his wound, trying to stop the bleeding. Her hands were stained red, her mind spinning with exhaustion, but she didn't stop. "You're not dying," she murmured, her voice trembling. It wasn't a plea, it was a promise. The shepherd's golden eyes met hers. There was pain in them, exhaustion, but there was something else too. Trust. A lump formed in her throat. He had no reason to trust her, not after everything he had been through, but he did. Even now, when he was barely clinging to life, he still looked at her like she was his only hope. And maybe she was. She exhaled shakily, brushing a strand of damp hair from her face. "We're gonna make it," she said softly. "I don't care what it takes. I don't care who they are. We're getting out of this." The dog didn't move, but his breathing was still steady. That was enough. She leaned back against the wall, exhaustion pulling at her limbs. She needed to rest, to gather her strength. But she couldn't afford to sleep. Not yet. Instead, she stared out the broken window, watching the jungle beyond. The trees stood tall, their leaves rustling in the soft breeze. It was peaceful, deceptively so. She knew better than to believe in peace. The real fight was still ahead. But for now, for this moment, they had made it. And when the sun rose, she would be ready. For them, for him, for whatever came next. The first rays of dawn pierced through the cracks in the rusted outpost, casting long, golden beams across the concrete floor. Isabella sat slumped against the wall, her body sore and stiff from the night before. Her fingers twitched against the shepherd's fur, still feeling the steady, fragile rhythm of his breathing. He was alive. But for how much longer? She had spent the entire night listening. Every rustling leaf, every distant cry of a jungle bird had sent her heart pounding against her ribs. She had expected the men to find them, to storm into the outpost with their guns raised, ready to finish what they had started. But the jungle had remained eerily silent. That silence was almost worse than the chase. The shepherd stirred beside her, letting out a low, pained whimper. Isabella's heart clenched as she placed a soothing hand on his side. His golden eyes fluttered open, heavy with exhaustion, but they still focused on her. "Hey," she whispered, "you're still with me." A weak flick of his tail was the only response he could manage. She swallowed hard, pushing herself to her feet. Every muscle in her body protested, her bones aching from the hours spent on the cold floor. She had to move. Staying here was a death sentence. The men might not have found them yet, but they would. And when they did, there would be no escape. Her gaze drifted across the abandoned outpost. It had been stripped of anything useful, no supplies, no weapons, nothing that could help her fight back. The air smelled of damp decay, the walls lined with rusting shelves, but in the farthest corner, partially buried under debris, she spotted something metal locker, its door slightly ajar. Hope flickered through her exhaustion as she crossed the room. She gripped the handle, yanking it open with a loud screech of rusted metal. Inside, she found a backpack. Her hands trembled as she pulled it out, her fingers fumbling with the straps. She tore it open, her breath catching when she saw what was inside: a medical kit, water bottles, and a few ration packs covered in dust but still sealed. It wasn't much, but it was enough. She wasted no time. She grabbed a bottle, twisting the cap off with shaky hands, then carefully brought it to the dog's mouth. He lapped at the water slowly, his body still too weak to move much. Relief coursed through her. He was dehydrated, but he still had the strength to drink. That meant he still had a chance. Next, she ripped open the medical kit. She wasn't a doctor, but she had basic first aid knowledge. She carefully unwrapped the bloodied fabric she had used as a makeshift bandage the night before. The wound was still raw, the edges red and inflamed. Infection was setting in. "Damn it," she muttered under her breath. She worked quickly, pouring antiseptic over the wound. The shepherd let out a pained yelp, his muscles twitching, but he didn't pull away. Isabella bit her lip, her hands steady even as her chest tightened at the sound of his pain. She wrapped fresh gauze around the wound, securing it tightly. It wasn't perfect, but it would hold. "All right, boy," she murmured, brushing a hand gently over his head. "We're not done yet." The moment she said the words, a sound sent a bolt of ice through her veins. A branch snapping. Outside. He lunged, his body a blur of motion despite the pain racking him. The bullet grazed his side, but he didn't stop. His jaws clamped down on the man's arm, ripping flesh from bone. A scream tore through the air. Chaos exploded around them. Isabella ducked just as another gun fired, the bullet whizzing past her ear. She hit the ground hard, rolling as another soldier lunged at her. She kicked out, catching him in the knee. He staggered, but not before grabbing hold of her wrist. Pain flared as he twisted her arm, trying to force her down. She fought. She slammed her elbow into his face, breaking free just as the shepherd took another soldier down. The leader was still screaming, his arm torn and useless, blood dripping through his fingers. "Kill them!" he roared. Another gun fired. The shepherd yelped. Isabella's world went red. She grabbed the fallen soldier's rifle without thinking, swinging it around in one fluid motion. The man who had shot the dog barely had time to register what was happening before she pulled the trigger. The recoil nearly knocked her back, but she didn't stop. The bullet hit him square in the chest. He crumpled, his gun falling uselessly to the ground. A second man turned his weapon toward her, but the shepherd was there before he could fire. He lunged, his teeth finding purchase in the man's throat. A wet, sickening gurgle followed. The remaining soldiers hesitated, their confidence faltering. They hadn't expected this. They hadn't expected her. Or the dog they had created to fight back. Isabella leveled the rifle at them, her finger steady on the trigger. "Drop your weapons," she commanded, her voice cold. The soldiers glanced at each other, unsure. The shepherd stood beside her, his body bloodied but still standing, still growling, still ready to fight. And that was all it took. One by one, the soldiers dropped their weapons. She exhaled shakily, her grip tightening around the gun. She wanted to kill them all. But she wasn't like them. "Go," she ordered, "and don't ever come after us again." The men hesitated. Then, without another word, they turned and disappeared into the jungle. The shepherd watched them go, his breathing heavy. Isabella knelt beside him, pressing a hand against his fur. "We did it," she whispered. For the first time, the shepherd didn't just look at her with gratitude. He looked at her like she was his pack. His family. They had won. But she knew this wasn't the end. Because whatever secrets the shepherd carried, whatever darkness he had escaped from, it wasn't over. Not yet. And she would be ready. To be continued. Her breath caught in her throat. The shepherd's ears twitched, his eyes suddenly alert despite his exhaustion. They had found them. She scrambled to her feet, her pulse roaring in her ears. There was no time to think, no time to plan. Only one option left. Run. She grabbed the backpack, slinging it over her shoulders before carefully lifting the shepherd into her arms. He let out a weak grunt, but he didn't fight her. He knew. They had to go. Isabella moved swiftly, slipping through the rusted-out door and into the dense jungle beyond. The air was thick with morning mist, the trees stretching high above like silent sentinels. She didn't stop to look back, but she heard them. Voices, footsteps, moving fast. They were coming. She pushed forward, her legs screaming in protest. The uneven terrain made every step a struggle, but she didn't let herself slow down. She had made a promise to herself, to the dog. She wasn't going to let them take him. A bullet ripped through the air. She ducked, instinct taking over. The shot struck a tree beside her, bark exploding in a sharp burst of debris. Her cover was blown. A voice shouted behind her, "She's heading east, cut her off." Panic surged through her veins, but she forced it down. She needed a way out, a way to lose them. Then she saw its ravine, its edge barely visible through the thick foliage. The drop was steep, disappearing into a fast-moving river below. It was suicide. But staying here meant death. She didn't hesitate. Taking a deep breath, she tightened her grip on the shepherd and sprinted toward the edge. The ground disappeared beneath her feet. She fell. The world blurred into a rush of green and blue. Wind roared in her ears. The shepherd let out a sharp yelp, his body pressed against hers as they plummeted toward the water below. Then, impact. The cold hit her like a punch to the chest, knocking the air from her lungs. The current dragged her under, spinning her in the darkness. She kicked, fought, forcing herself to the surface. Her head broke through, and she gasped, sucking in a desperate breath of air. Where was he? Her eyes darted around frantically. The river was rushing too fast, the current pulling her downstream. Then, a splash. The shepherd surfaced a few feet away, paddling weakly, his eyes wide with fear. Relief and terror warred inside her. She pushed toward him, her arms burning with effort. She reached out, grabbing hold of him just as another wave crashed over them. They were sinking. Her limbs were numb, her strength fading. The river was relentless, dragging them further and further from the jungle, from the men hunting them. She didn't know how long they drifted. Minutes, hours, an eternity. Then rocks. She barely had time to react before the current slammed her into them. Pain exploded through her body as she clung to the jagged surface, pulling the shepherd against her chest. The river had carried them far, but now, finally, it had delivered them somewhere else. Somewhere safer. The sounds of gunfire were long gone. She pulled herself onto the shore, collapsing onto the wet stones, the shepherd's body still in her arms. They had escaped. But the fight wasn't over. Not yet. To be continued. The river had spared them, but just barely. Isabella lay sprawled on the rocky shore, her body aching from the relentless current. Her clothes were soaked, clinging to her skin like a second layer of ice. She forced herself to sit up, wincing as sharp pain shot through her ribs. Every muscle in her body screamed for rest, but she didn't have the luxury of stopping. She turned to the shepherd. He was still beside her, shivering, his golden fur drenched. His breathing was labored, his body weak, but he was alive. That was all that mattered. Isabella reached out, her fingers brushing against his fur. "We made it," she whispered, though her voice was hoarse, unsure. But had they really? The river had carried them far, she could tell by the unfamiliar stretch of land before them. The jungle still loomed in the distance, thick and impenetrable, but something was different here. The trees weren't as dense, the air carried the faintest hint of salt. The ocean. She turned, scanning the horizon, and her stomach twisted. Through the breaks in the trees, she could see its sliver of gray-blue water stretching into the distance. They had been pushed closer to the coast, which meant they were running out of land to escape to. A rustling in the trees made her heart leap into her throat. She froze. The shepherd tensed beside her, ears pricked, body rigid despite his wounds. His golden eyes locked onto the jungle, his breathing suddenly silent. Something was coming. Or someone. Isabella's mind raced. The men should have been far behind them, the river had swept them away too quickly for their pursuers to keep up. But that didn't mean they weren't still looking. She needed to move. Now. With shaking hands, she pulled herself to her feet, staggering under the weight of exhaustion. She reached for the shepherd, but he tried to stand on his own, his legs wobbling before he found his balance. They didn't have time. She turned toward the coastline, her mind scrambling for a plan. If they followed the shoreline, maybe... A voice cut through the silence. "Move and you're dead." Ice flooded her veins. Slowly, she turned. A man stood at the edge of the trees, rifle aimed directly at her chest. His clothes were soaked, mud smeared across his arms and face. He had followed them. He wasn't alone. More figures emerged from the jungle, their weapons drawn, their eyes cold and unyielding. There were 5 of them, maybe more hidden in the trees. They had been waiting, tracking her even as she ran. She had led them straight to the water's edge. There was nowhere left to go. The shepherd growled low in his throat, his fur bristling, his stance lowering into something defensive despite his injuries. He knew. This was a fight they wouldn't win. The leader, she recognized him now, the same man who had captured her before, tilted his head, watching her like a predator sizing up its prey. "You should have let the dog die," he said. Isabella's fists clenched. "You should have left him alone." A small smirk tugged at the man's lips. "You don't know what he is, do you?" Isabella stayed silent. The man sighed, as if she had disappointed him. "That thing," he motioned toward the shepherd with a flick of his gun. "He's not just a dog. He was designed, built for war, trained to be the perfect weapon. And you're just a liability." Her stomach twisted. She had known the dog was special, that he had come from something unnatural. But hearing it now, from the people who had tried to erase him, made it all the more horrifying. They had wanted to break him, to turn him into a tool. But he had run, and they couldn't stand that. The leader took a step forward. "Give him up, and I'll consider letting you walk away." The shepherd let out a guttural snarl. Isabella didn't hesitate. "Go to hell." The man sighed, shaking his head. Shame. The gunshot came faster than she could react. But the shepherd was faster. The ocean wind carried the scent of salt and freedom as Isabella sat on the rocky shoreline, her fingers absently stroking the shepherd's golden fur. The sun was beginning to rise, its soft orange glow stretching across the water, painting the sky in shades of hope. The storm had passed. The fight was over. But she knew better than to believe in endings. The shepherd lay beside her, exhausted but alive. His wounds would heal, given time. He had survived everything they had thrown at him just like she had. They were the same, in a way. Both hunted. Both fighting for something beyond survival. She exhaled slowly, her mind replaying everything that had led them here. The jungle, the chase, the men who had tried to take him back. The way he had fought, not just for himself, but for her. She had never known loyalty like that. Her fingers traced the jagged scar on his muzzle. "What did they do to you?" she murmured, half to herself. The shepherd lifted his head slightly, his golden eyes locking onto hers. He was listening. He always listened. For a long time, neither of them moved. The waves crashed against the shore. The seagulls called in the distance. It should have felt peaceful. But Isabella couldn't shake the feeling that they were still in danger. Because even though the soldiers had retreated, she knew men like that never truly gave up. Project Fenrir. The words still haunted her, lingering in the back of her mind like a ghost. She didn't know the full truth, but she knew enough. The shepherd wasn't just an animal. He had been made for something. A weapon, a soldier, something more than just a companion. And she had stolen him from the people who had created him. They wouldn't let that go. Her gaze drifted toward the tree line, scanning for movement. The jungle was still, but she didn't trust it. Not anymore. They needed to leave. But where could they go? She had spent her whole life running from expectations, from responsibility, from the weight of being Victor Kensington's daughter. But this was different. This time, she wasn't running for herself. She was running for him. The shepherd let out a low rumble, shifting beside her. He was restless, too. "We can't stay here," she said softly, more to herself than him. She pushed herself to her feet, her legs still weak, her body aching from the fight. She slung the backpack over her shoulder, adjusting the straps as she looked down at him. "Can you walk?" The shepherd huffed, pulling himself up slowly. He was still injured, his movements stiff, but he stood. That was enough. She smiled faintly. "Good boy." The words felt too small for what he had done, what he had become to her. She turned toward the coastline, scanning the horizon. There had to be a village nearby, a port, something that could get them out of here. She had money, her father's money, and for once, she didn't feel guilty about using it. She glanced at the shepherd. "Let's go." He fell into step beside her without hesitation. They walked for hours, following the shoreline as the sun climbed higher in the sky. The jungle eventually gave way to rocky cliffs, and beyond that civilization, a small fishing town, barely more than a collection of wooden houses and boats swaying in the harbor. It wasn't much, but it was exactly what they needed. Isabella pulled the hood of her jacket up, shielding her face as they approached. She didn't know if the soldiers had radioed ahead, if there were still eyes searching for them. She couldn't take any chances. She found a quiet alleyway between two buildings and crouched beside the shepherd, her voice low. "We need a boat, something fast, something that doesn't ask questions." The dog simply watched her, as if waiting for her next move. She had never realized how much comfort there was in fathoming someone who didn't doubt her, didn't question her, just trusted her. Taking a deep breath, she moved toward the docks. The town was quiet, fishermen unloading their morning catch. The scent of salt and diesel thick in the air. Isabella's eyes scanned the boats, searching for something small, discreet. Then she saw it. A man in his late 50s, weathered by the sun, standing beside a modest fishing boat. He was speaking with a younger man, shaking his head as he gestured toward the engine. A broken-down boat. A desperate fisherman. She could work with that. Isabella approached cautiously, keeping her movements calm. "Excuse me," she said, her voice even. The older man turned, his eyes narrowing. "You lost?" She shook her head. "I need passage out of here. Fast." The man's gaze flickered over her, then to the shepherd at her side. Not a lot of places to go. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a thick stack of bills. Someplace quiet, no questions asked. The fisherman's eyes widened slightly, but he didn't take the money. Not yet. "You running from something?" "Just trying to get away," she said carefully. The man studied her for a long moment before finally sighing. "Boat's busted. Needs a new fuel pump." She nodded. "Where can we get one?" The fisherman hesitated, then gestured toward the other end of the docks. "Supply shop. If you can get it, we leave by nightfall." Isabella didn't wait. She turned, already moving. The shepherd followed. It took another hour to find what they needed, another 2 to help the fisherman install the new part. By the time the sun had dipped below the horizon, the boat was ready. They set off under cover of darkness, the waves lapping gently against the hull. Isabella sat at the bow, the wind cool against her face. The shepherd was beside her, his head resting against her knee. She didn't know where they were going, didn't know what came next. But for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid. She reached down, running her fingers through his fur. "We're free," she whispered. The shepherd exhaled, his body finally relaxing. For now, that was enough. But she knew this wasn't over. The people behind Project Fenrir wouldn't just forget about them. One day, they would come looking. And when they did, she would be ready. Call to action. Some bonds are forged in fire, in moments of desperation, in battles fought side by side. Isabella and the shepherd didn't just escape, they defied the people who tried to control them. But freedom always comes with a cost, and their fight isn't over. Would you risk everything to protect someone who saved you? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more stories of courage, survival, and unexpected connections, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. You never know what story might change the way you see the world.